were at that time in the original disposition, the fitra, knowing, perceiving. Then, when they alighted in this form, that is the human body, they forgot the witnessing. Then God sent the prophets and messengers, reminding the people of that covenant. So whoever attests to the covenant is saved, and whoever denies it is destroyed. When continuing the commentary on to 7.173, Ibn Ajiba writes, the implication is, we took that covenant in the world of spirits and sent the messengers renewing it in the world of figures, that is, this world, to avoid your saying, we were oblivious to this. Ibn Ajiba then likens verse 7.173 to verse 17.15. And never do we punish until we have sent a messenger. And then to verse 4.165, which speaks of, quote, messengers who are sent as bearers of glad tidings and as warners, that mankind might have no argument against God after the messengers. Regarding all of these verses, Ibn Ajiba writes, the testification as spirits does not suffice as proof against them during the resurrection, because the spirits forgot that covenant when they entered the world of figures. So they do not guide them to it except through an indication which reminds them of it, by which Ibn Ajiba here means the revelations sent through God's prophets. As Al-Qurtubi writes when commenting on 7.172, when they neglect the covenant, God reminds them through his prophets and seals the reminding with the purest of them, that being in his mind the Prophet Muhammad, for them to be, that is the prophets, to be witnesses against them, that is humanity. From the perspective proposed by this line of interpretation, every covenant made while humankind is on earth is a recognition, renewal, and continuation of the pre-temporal covenant made while they were disembodied, or if you will, pre-embodied spirits. What one could call the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition is thus seen as a multifaceted series of temporal manifestations of a single pre-temporal covenant. The function of revelation and prophecy, for which another special covenant was made with the prophets, is then to reawaken the awareness of this imprint and remind humankind that they must return to the observance of the first covenant. To support this position, commentaries upon 7.172, such as that of At-Tabari, cite a wide range of Quranic verses. I'm not going to go into all those right here because apparently I only have 5 minutes, and that's not going to happen, but I'll try. Now, being presented as a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition, as another reminder in this series of reminders, the Qur'an explicitly confirms the covenant that God made with previous communities, seeking to remind not only of the covenant made before spirits were embodied, but also of the previous covenants made while human spirits were embodied. In the Qur'an, the line of prophecy thus does not begin necessarily with Noah or Abraham or Moses. Rather, it is said to begin with Adam, Adam being viewed as the first of all prophets, and the first breaking of the covenant is that Adam and Eve conduct, not just Eve first and then influencing Adam as in the Bible, but the first breaking is said to be Adam and Eve, and then when Adam and Eve come and are on the earth, in a sense, God renews the covenant with them, and they renew the covenant. So that can be seen, in a sense, as the beginning of the cycle from a Quranic position. Now, seen in this light, the underlying substance of the human condition is the Adamic nature before the fall, a nature by virtue of which the human being is said to be, as we saw with Ibn Ajiba, knowing, perceiving. That is, ever aware of the pre-temporal covenant and all that it entails. According to the majority of commentators, this nature is what is referred to in the Qur'an as the fitra, the original disposition, or literally the initial cleaving mentioned in 30:30, a verse that almost every major commentary links to the discussion of 7:172, just as most commentaries also cite 7:172 when discussing 30:30. Now, the nature of the link that the commentators see between these two verses can probably best be seen in the words attributed to the famous 2nd, 3rd Islamic century Quranic commentator Ad-Dahhak, who is reported to have said, when his infant son was being prepared for burial, he died upon the first covenant, upon the fitrah. Now, verse 30:30 reads, "Set thy face to religion as one truly devout," a hanif, "in the original disposition, the fitrah of God, upon which he originated mankind. There is no alteration in God's creation. That is the religion upright, but most people know not." This verse is taken by most commentators to be a command to follow the religion of God for which he created human beings. It is interpreted as being addressed directly to the prophet or to all who hear the message, though in both interpretations the meaning is said to apply to all human beings. Some commentators take the first phrase to mean follow the religion as one truly devout, a hanif, and follow the original disposition in which God created you. That's Qurtubi and Tabari take that approach. In another slightly less tenable interpretation, original disposition is said to modify religion, meaning set thy face to the religion as one truly devout, as God originated it. In either interpretation, it implies that human beings were made for tawheed, for religion, and for worship. In this vein, many cite the famous verse 51-56, "And I did not create jinn and mankind save to worship me," implying that to be in a state of worship is to live in accord with the fitrah. Now, when discussing 30:30, it is important to mention that many people see it as something that pertains only to Islam with a capital I, the reified religion of Islam. And this is definitely something which is found in the classical tradition. However, I think that one can be justified in reading it as, shall we say, relating to submission, or shall we say Islam with a little I. And this is something that one can be found, in several of the classical commentaries, such as Al-Qurtubi, who says that this is a misguided interpretation. As he observes, it is impossible for the fitrah here mentioned to be Islam with a capital I, and that's my kind of translation, my insertion, because Islam and Iman are declaring with the tongue, embracing with the heart, and performing with the limbs. So what he is implying is that if fitrah pertains to the original human disposition, that of the spirit, it cannot pertain to the specific practices of a particular religious tradition, because these can only be performed while a spirit resides in a body in this world. Qurtubi goes on to say, this pertains to the innate character and disposition that is in the soul of a child, which is destined and established to distinguish that which God has fashioned. The child is guided to his Lord by the innate character and knows God's laws and believes in him. So it is as if God said, set thy face to the religion that is Hanif, devotion, and it is the originating by God in preparation for which God originated humanity. But obstacles arise for them. Regarding this, there is the saying of the prophet, every child is born upon the fitrah. Then its parents make it a Christian, a Jew, or a Zoroastrian. And the mention of the parents is an example of the obstacles, which are many. Al-Qurtubi continues, our Shaykh has said, verily God creates the hearts of the children of Adam with an aptitude for receiving the truth, just as he created their eyes and their ears receptive to things seen and things heard. When viewed in light of this line of interpretation, it is to bring human beings back to this original disposition that all religions are fashioned or revealed. But over time, human beings lose sight of this and follow religion with taqlid, with blind adherence, rather than iman, faith. Religious affiliations that do not remain focused upon the universal realities of the heart of each covenant can thus come to be seen as so many superimpositions upon the original human disposition. This is implied by an interpretation of 7.172 that Ibn Ajiba attributes to al-Baydawi, but I have not found it in al-Baydawi's tafsir. Quote, "What is intended by these words here," and that is, he's referring to the fact that 7.172 comes after the discussion of the covenant made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai. He says, "It is to compel the Jews to follow the general covenant after they have followed the covenant that is particular to them, and preventing them from taqlid, blind adherence." Now, to conclude and go a little bit over my time, my apologies, this brief examination is only able to provide a general outline of the Quranic presentation of the covenant, and we can only examine a few verses in depth here. Nonetheless, we can say that an expanded reading of the commentary tradition makes it clear that there is a notion of covenantal pluralism inherent to the traditional Islamic understanding of the Qur'an and of revelation in general. The multiple covenants envisioned by Quranic exegetes can be said to unfold in three phases. The first is the primordial pretemporal general covenant made by God with all human beings when they were taken from the loins of Adam. The second is the special covenant made by God with the prophets that they will call people to worship and thus back to observance of the first covenant. And the third is prepared by the second, and this is the phase on earth wherein human beings take one of the particular covenants with which God has sent the prophets as a recognition and renewal of the generation of the general covenant that had made before time. A full recognition of this covenantal pluralism within the Qur'an and within the Islamic tradition has important implications for Islamic theology, especially as many traditionally minded Muslims still grapple with the question of the other. Developments in this area could even give rise to a classically rooted and canonically literate Islamic theology of the other that is not in deep tension with the contemporary pluralistic experience. Rather than viewing the succession of covenants throughout human history as superseding or abrogating one another, as many Muslims are wont to do, each can be seen as bearing witness to the reality of the first covenant, and every human being can be viewed as one who is born upon the fitra, and thus as one who bears witness to the original covenant within. Thank you.
Thank you. Concerning the covenant, there is a McGill University thesis by Abdul Karim Shirazi, and also Naqib al-Attas from Malaysia has written books on covenant, as you know, as you mentioned, that primordial covenant by Junaid Baghdadi, al-Baghdadi developed this idea. And I would like to hear more if you have some say to primordial covenant by Baghdadi, Junaid al-Baghdadi. Thank you.
I actually, in all honesty, it's a good question, but I actually, the covenant referred to by Junaid al-Baghdadi, one of the reasons this is very important is because since a lot of the literature on the covenant has been done in the field of Sufi studies, and people tend to cite Junaid al-Baghdadi and others, there has been a tendency to almost relegate the sense of covenant to a, quote, Sufi concept, unquote. And this is one of the fundamentally important things, and it's why, for example, I'm not citing people like Junaid al-Baghdadi, but I'm citing Tabari, Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir. is to show that this is actually something that you find in what people would call, what I call for lack of a better term, the mainline tafsir tradition. And show that there is nothing that is really very different in the fundamental substance of the understanding of the covenant. Now, what you have with Junaid, and it's been a long time since I've read Junaid on this, so I'm going to be generalizing more about the Sufi tradition than Junaid in particular. But is that the focus is fundamentally saying that we have this covenant, and to focus upon the purification of the heart as the means of attaining and observing this covenant with God. Something which I think, as you can see, is alluded to in the mainline tradition with Qurtubi and others as well.
I believe that Wadad al-Qadi, she actually gave a talk on this, but I think she also has a written version of this talk which addresses, what was it, 7172? The notion of the primordial covenant. I couldn't tell you what the source of it is, but I'll look for it. But I think she has, some insights in that paper that I think would complement yours very, very nicely. And I remember she had mentioned that the Kharijites had some interesting insights on the notion of covenant. And I was wondering if you had a chance to look at some Khariji or Ibadi commentaries, like Hud ibn Muhakkam, or yeah, just to throw it out there to see if that
I will look down.
Fabulous topic, and I hope that we see a conference on the covenant in the not too distant future, because it is, I agree with you that it is utterly key. The wonderful book it's actually almost a monograph, it was done in Beirut some years ago, and it's been published now, and it's available. I have a copy, I'll happily send it to you.
Please.
It's magisterial. I've worked a little bit on covenant questions as well, and I'm experimenting with the idea that the covenant scenario in the tradition, in the Islamic tradition, is a theory about the birth of consciousness as such, and that this is what unites everybody, and it is a upwelling, and it's why it's one of the reasons why, however we may translate the word Islam, we may also translate it, at least partly, as enlightenment, because it is an existential experience and a calling back to that time which occurs at every second, ideally, right? My question is that in the hadith of the Fitra that you quoted, why is Islam not mentioned?
That's a very good question. I think that one thing, first of all, I actually I was at a conference about 2 years ago, and the then president of Al-Azhar, now Sheikh Al-Azhar, Ahmad Al-Tayyib, stood up, and in response to another speaker, he said that every time you come across the word Islam and Muslim in the Qur'an, it should be understood as having a general meaning to all human beings and all of humanity, and not the reified meaning that we now give it in our commentary tradition. So I think that would be one way of saying it, that this is not that the identification of, and that's why I made the distinction between the Islam with the capital and Islam with the little I. And so I side with him in that, and I think that could be one way of putting it. However, and this is actually something which I've done in the broader treatment of this, which I didn't do here, which is that there are many ahadith where the Prophet ﷺ basically says, Muslims are going to do this too. This is, you guys are going to go down the path of those before you. And basically, and there are just many hadith that warn the Muslims of the ways in which they are going to turn their religion into an idol, just as others have done in the past. So those are two reasons why. And I think another is just pragmatic. If you're in there in the midst of establishing this new foundation, you can't really point people to what you might call is the relativity of this that you are of what you are establishing, because that's not going to work for a large human collectivity.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Some people consider that you were at least one of the authors of the Common Word movement about 5 years ago. And I'm wondering whether you see any, ask you whether the concept of covenantal pluralism as a means to project, call it primordial truth in the world, can be effective in countering truth as ideology, which is a closed system of thought, which is one of our major problems in the world today. Is this going to be effective, do you think? Because people ask me that. You know, you scholars, this is wonderful stuff. What difference is it going to make? Can this be important in the Common Word movement?
It might be. I would hope that some discussion of this, that there might be openings for it. It's, as I said in the paper that I gave on the Common Word here just 2 days ago, one of the roles that I think that scholars can play in the Common Word movement, because as academics, we don't really represent constituencies, and therefore we, in a sense, risk less when we venture new approaches to theology and the faith, is that we can, in a sense, push the envelope. But that's also why I said at the end of this paper that it has to be, in a sense, scripturally grounded and canonically literate. This is one of the main problems that you find in the vast majority of interreligious dialogue, is that it's not always canonically literate. And so it doesn't really establish, okay, I've come up with this new idea of covenant, or let's say if I really take this covenant, and it happens to be that this idea of covenant is found in the tafsir of Ibn Kathir or Qurtubi, but I'm actually going to talk about how it's found in Tustari or Al-Junayd al-Baghdadi, bam, I just lost 90% of my audience. And so it has to be done in a very subtle way, where you can cultivate what can be found in what I refer to as the mainline tradition. And perhaps it could have some influence. It depends on who picks up on it. For example, this observation that was made by Ahmad al-Tayyib. I know that he has kind of come to that as a process of being engaged with a lot of other academics. And so these are subtle ways in which things like this can influence and push the envelope of the broader discourse. I wouldn't say necessarily that I'm going to do it, but it would be nice if it had some influence, some positive effect.
If no one else has a question, I have a quick question, which is one of the things I think is interesting in 7172, and maybe in the idea of covenant generally, and I'm happy to see that you mentioned it to some extent, is this strange combination of freedom and constraint. That they have to testify. The question is rhetorical. So it's not absolute, and you can say that's of course true even in the Judaic covenant, right? I mean, you enter into it freely, but God sets the terms, right? And you either agree or you disagree. And in any of the literature, has there been a discussion about this idea? Because in some exegetical traditions and some hadith traditions, this verse, although it does seem to me, I agree with you, to be absolutely connected to this idea of human free will, gets tied to hadith that are compulsionist even, in certainly predestinarian in content. So how are these issues sort of brought out in any of the...
Yeah, thanks for bringing up predestination and free will, my favorite topic, and I'm going to solve it in 5 minutes.
Well, I'm just asking.
Yeah, no.
Yes,
I mean, in terms of what I have come across, and I've gone through about 10 different tafsir on the different verses that I'm talking about here. I have not found what I hold to be a satisfactory treatment of that particular issue within there. I mean, even in, as you well know, the place within the commentary tradition where free will and predestination is taken head on, shall we say, by most mufassirs, is in Surah Al-Qamar, towards the end of Surah Al-Qamar. I think it's 54, 56. And even there, there's still not really a satisfactory answer to how one can negotiate this notion of God being all-powerful and imposing this upon us, and God and then human beings having tasrif of some kind in order to engage in this. And so my personal opinion is that ultimately the only freedom comes about, and this can only really be solved on the level of esotericism, is that the only true freedom is when you completely submit and participate in the divine freedom, and then that is absolute freedom. And only absolute freedom can be true freedom, because freedom implies complete lack of limitation. And therefore,